My name is Valerie, and this is my story. So my fertility story really starts back when early in my career I was working in women's health and in medical sales, and really began to think about like family futures and how I would eventually have a family someday. I feel really blessed that my education and my work history helped me think about these topics long before I was ever ready to start my family. And egg freezing was really coming onto the scene in 2012. And when that happened, it caused me to pause and think about like, oh, could this be something that I would want to take advantage of, because I haven't been able to find a parenting partner or someone that would equal family and kids. So I really started looking into egg freezing. And in 2015, when I was 33 years old, was the first time I decided to give it a go and see what it was all about. So I went in for my initial doctor's appointment where they tested my AMH levels and did an initial appointment with a vaginal ultrasound that they call an intrafollicle count, and saw if I was even a good candidate for egg freezing. And what we learned was that yes, in fact, it was a good time to do egg freezing. I had a decent amount of egg yield that allowed me to freeze my eggs. And so I decided to take advantage of the situation that I had at that time because I had time off work. And luckily, I had a very specific insurance plan with Illinois in Chicago that paid for part of the procedure. So that helped with some of the medications. And I was actually probably the most nervous when I was thinking about egg freezing, never doing it before. I had heard of other people doing like IVF, which is the first half of egg freezing, but I had never done it myself, and so I was probably the most concerned about like what the hormones would make me feel like, how I would feel on these hormones. And so when I started the injections, I was kind of nervous. I was actually didn't know if I could do the shots myself or if it was kind of a big deal. So I went over to a friend's house that had done IVF and fertility before to have her 2 children. And luckily she helped me get over the nerves and the initial shots that was kind of like, it was scary at first to do. But then once I had that first initial medications that I injected myself with, I was like, oh, this isn't as hard as it looks. So, it got easier. I got really fast mixing the different medications and dialing up the pen and making sure that I had the right dosage that my doctor prescribed. And it seemed like it was going pretty well. And then like a couple days in, I went through to my monitoring visit and they said, okay, great, your follicles are growing at an appropriate size for this time period. We're gonna keep your medications the same. And so I did that for about 12 to 13 days. And then I had a retrieval actually on my grandparents' anniversary, which was kind of cool. And they were able to pull out 22 eggs. And then I was able to successfully freeze 17. And that was my first egg freezing experience in 2015. So I was 33 years old at the time. And I felt great. Like I was like, oh wow, I just did this like really incredible thing for myself. It felt very empowering. I felt like I was taking charge of my future. I had like this new relinquished look on dating, and I started seeing somebody, and like seemed very, very easy. And then when that relationship didn't work out and another year had passed and not much had changed, I thought about taking advantage of egg freezing again. And I decided that, with egg freezing, it's really a numbers game. And so I wanted to ensure that I had the best chance for a potential future baby if I were to get too old and not be able to conceive naturally. So, or for baby number 2 or baby number 3, and to have be proactive about my family size or my family dynamics. And so I took advantage of egg freezing again, and I decided to go to a different clinic this time just to check out the landscape and to decrease my different odds of variability with lab techs and labs in different environments. So in 2017, at 35 years old, I froze again. And it was pretty similar the second time. My medications were out of pocket, so I did have to worry about that. And luckily, I was able to get the freezing for a decent rate. So I shopped around a little bit more than I did the first time because I had insurance, and was able to do another cycle. And when I finished the second cycle, we pulled out 13 eggs and 12 successfully froze. So I have 29 eggs at the moment that are in the freezer. And as I begin, trying to proactively date, and dating's really changed, that whole landscape has just really been a bit of a challenge, especially because I work a lot and I travel. And so I just didn't know, what does this mean for me? And I thought, 30, just about 30 eggs sounds great, but they're in different locations. And if I decide to move them, something could happen in transportation or something could happen in the lab. Why don't I freeze again? So I'm actually starting my third cycle right now and increasing my odds, because it's not always just about the number of eggs, it's about the quality of those eggs as well. And now I'm 2 years older, or almost two years older, and I feel like it's a really great birthday present for myself, and a way to ensure my future that would allow me to really have the peace of mind that I did everything within my power to protect my family future. And so I'm going through that now, and I feel really good about these choices. I was approached with the idea that maybe I could look into making embryos this time, or possibly using donor sperm. But I've decided that embryos seem a little more than what I'm ready for, and that the goal is to have a child with a partner. And if I'm just going to become a single mom by choice, which I'm totally open to, that idea, I would be okay with waiting on that and finding donor sperm later, or making embryos later, and seeing how those eggs are actually going to perform. And so I've decided to just freeze eggs again, even though embryos probably have a better chance of the thaw rate being successful. But knowing that it's a numbers game, and if I want a family size, let's say of 2 or 3 kids, then I'm not getting started yet at 36, almost 37. Then I feel like one more freeze would just make me feel confident in my family future.
But all right, so through all of this, what would you say was the most challenging part of the egg freezing process?
Well, some of the challenging aspects of egg freezing is the financial part. It is a significant investment in your future that you may not actually need to use. But I think that it's worth the investment. There's a lot of things we could spend our money on, right? But it's all about priorities, and a family is a priority for me. So I realized that while men have the opportunity to rectify their family futures much later in life and don't have to think about some of these catastrophic choices that women do, I'm going to be proactive. And instead of looking at it more or less like, instead of it being something that I'm reacting to, I'd rather take a proactive approach and prepare for the future. So I would say that the costs are one part of the actual issue, but then the physical component of the emotional toll that egg freezing or a fertility cycle can play is also a key part in the whole cycle that is a little bit daunting, because each time you have fertility drugs in your system, you're not quite sure how you're going to respond. Maybe the dosing is different than a previous cycle, and so I think that what I noticed from like freeze number 2 versus freeze number 3 versus freeze number 1 is that every cycle is different, and your body is going to respond completely, whatever's character for that month. And it just because you responded a certain way the first time doesn't mean that it'll be the same the next time. So I guess it's a combo factor. It's a combo factor of like feeling good while you're doing the cycle, and then being able to feel okay with the costs and some of the significant investment that you're making towards your future.
Is there anything that you've experienced along the way that you feel like is usually kind of unspoken, or not really something that you were prepared for, or that anybody really talks about in egg freezing?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that no one really tells you about, and part of the reason why I wanted to begin the conversation about egg freezing more openly is, oftentimes when people hear about egg freezing, or like when I'm dating and I talk about egg freezing, like, hey, I have eggs in the bank, a lot of people don't know what that means. And so I think we need a better education system on reproductive health or sexual health, so we can understand that it doesn't mean that I'm not able to have children. It just means that I'm preserving it for the future. And another thing that often isn't talked about is some of the emotional roller coaster that you go on, that some days you feel okay and other days you feel really, really tired and low. And I guess I would say it would be similar to maybe how a pregnancy would feel, although I've never been pregnant, so I wouldn't know how to compare that. But it seems like the physical symptoms, are very similar to what maybe you would endure during conceiving a child. And I think that the lack of being able to exercise, or that you have to slow down your physical activity sometimes, where that can be a stress reliever. You've taken that off the table as an opportunity to relieve some stress, that there's anxiety that maybe is unfounded, that you didn't really expect or know that it were going to come up, that you have to figure out a way to kind of deal with that in a different manner or approach. So I really am a firm believer that during the freezing process, it's great to do like self-care type techniques, whether it be take a really long bath or allow your time to sleep longer, just because you really are spending so much energy and your body's working so hard to build those follicles up to the right size so you can retrieve them.
You mentioned dating in this a few times. I'm curious, how soon does your bank of eggs come up in dating?
Well, I'm really an open book, so I feel like if it's a problem, I'd rather have them learn about it sooner and end the relationship faster if they're not okay with it. A lot of times, though, I find that the men that I go on dates with are very inquisitive about it, and they want to learn more. And so we spend a lot of time talking about what that means, and I'm happy to explain that. In fact, I appreciate when they take interest in it, but I try not to bring it up too soon, because I need to interview them too as much as they're interviewing me, right? So it has to be kind of like a two-way street. And I also just am trying to get a general sense of whether I think that they might be a good fit for dating and a potential long-term relationship, and that our goals are aligned. So I try not to spend too much time on it, but it ultimately comes up pretty soon. I mean, when the topic of marriage and family and kids, or how, if they have any children, or if they have any siblings, like the idea of talking about family, when that key subject matter comes up, usually around that time is when I then go into the elaborate discussion or more detailed things about how I'm an egg freezer and why I chose to freeze my eggs, and the difference between just freezing eggs and freezing embryos, because there's a huge difference. And so just to reassure them that, you know, this is for my potential future relationship.
Yeah, it's really interesting. How has freezing eggs changed the way that you kind of look at your future, or has it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think when I froze the first time, it was still a landscape in 2015 where it was more hush hush and people didn't necessarily go out and tell the world. And I was kind of like so proud of it that I told all my friends, and you know, my family members were involved, and I was happy about the decision, and I met someone like right away. And so I don't know, maybe I was giving off this allure or this energy that was saying like I feel good about where I'm at right now. But you know, then you settle back into like everyday mundane life. Life throws you curveballs, all those things, and you don't think about it as much after it happens, until I decided that, hey, the 17 eggs that I originally froze, I don't feel confident that that's enough. Eggs are kind of like money, and you really can't have too many. So I started hearing stories about how women went back to use their eggs and they didn't have enough to equal an embryo that then turned into a live birth. So they say between 12 to 13 eggs equals one live birth. And so I didn't feel confident that only 17 was enough to make embryos depending on who the partner is. I mean, if I'm dealing with a partner that maybe has slower sperm or not as many, and when they do ICSI and inject the sperm into the egg, if that doesn't result into an embryo, then I would be really sad that I didn't take the opportunity to do it again, and that's why I froze additional times. And so I think overall, what I'm having the repercussions of making all those freezes is that I have less money in my savings account. You know, so there are some sacrifices that you have to make in order to do that. And also, like for example, I used to travel a ton overseas and go on a vacation every year, and I haven't done that in my 30s. And so there is a bit of a personal sacrifice I've had to make to decide that my family in this time in my life is the most important.
All right, just one more question for you. What is one piece of advice you would give to somebody, I guess, considering egg freezing or kind of just getting into the idea?
So I get asked all the time, like, what I would tell somebody that hasn't froze before or is thinking about egg freezing. And the number one thing I always suggest is start learning about it. There's great podcasts, there's great websites out there. There's tons of resources that are at your disposal to ask all the key questions and to start researching it. And then go get your levels checked. So your AMH levels, go get your antral follicle count done with a vaginal ultrasound. Find a fertility clinic you feel comfortable with. Shop around, ask all the questions ahead of time, and then make an informed choice after that. I think a lot of women especially make the egg freezing choice based off their current relationship, and I highly suggest not doing that. Like, make this choice independent of any relationship status, because even if you're married doesn't mean that that will be your parenting partner. You could possibly get divorced, and I know a lot of women that have decided to egg freeze after they got divorced. And so why not waste all those precious years where your fertility is the strongest and you can get the most bang for your buck when you freeze younger and get more viable eggs in one cycle. And I just think that if you are even considering it, I have yet to hear one person say that they wish they wouldn't have done it after they did. So I think that that is very reassuring.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't think it's something that you would regret, you know.